They tell you the Emperor protects, but they never mention what he protects you from, or for how long, or whether protection means anything more than delaying your death by hours instead of minutes. I learned that truth on Infernace Prime, where the ground itself wanted us dead, and the air tasted like copper and sulfur, and the slow dissolution of hope. My name was Corporal Venko Harith of the 88th Helican Rifles, and I served the God Emperor faithfully for 217 days on a world that should never have been garrisoned by human flesh. This is my testimony, recorded into a Vox unit whose battery will outlive me by perhaps a day, maybe less. If you find this, know that we did our duty. Know that we held the line. Know that it didn't matter. The heat is what kills you first, though not quickly enough to be merciful. When our dropships punched through Infernace Prime's ash-thick atmosphere, the temperature readouts inside our transport climbed to 48 degrees standard before we even made landfall. 48 degrees. And that was with the ship's cooling systems running at maximum capacity, recycling the same stale air through filters already clogged with volcanic particulate. I remember Private Chenault vomiting into his helmet before we hit ground, the sour stench mixing with the omnipresent smell of overheated metal and unwashed bodies packed into a tin can, hurtling toward a surface that glowed red in places where the crust was thin enough for the magma beneath to shine through like the Emperor's own wrath made manifest. We lost 3 men in the first hour groundside. Not to enemy action, there was no enemy yet, though the briefing had mentioned orc presence in the equatorial zones, but to heatstroke and cardiac arrest. Trooper Malish collapsed while unloading ammunition crates, his heart simply stopping in his chest, as if his body had decided that continued existence on Infernace Prime was an affront to biological sense. Troopers Vex and Holman died in their sleep that first night, if you could call it sleep, if you could call it night. The planet's rotation was 26 hours. But the sun never truly set behind the volcanic cloud cover, only dimmed from brilliant white to sullen orange, and the temperature only dropped to 42 degrees during what passed for darkness. They simply didn't wake up when we roused the garrison at 0500, their bodies already cooling in their bunks, faces slack and peaceful, the only peace anyone found on that hell world. The base was called Firebase Leonidas, a designation that implied grandeur and historical weight, though in reality it was nothing more than a collection of prefabricated rockcrete bunkers arranged in concentric defensive rings around a landing pad that could accommodate 2 Valkyries at most. The Adeptus Mechanicus had established a mining operation somewhere in the northern wastes, extracting something valuable enough to warrant an Imperial Guard presence, but not valuable enough to waste climate-controlled habitation domes on the protection detail. We were there to ensure the orcs didn't interfere with the extraction quotas, and if a few hundred guardsmen cooked to death in the process, well, that was simply the acceptable cost of maintaining the Imperium's industrial base. Our commanding officer was Captain Drusus Morvan, a career soldier who had survived 20 years in the Guard by being neither brave enough to earn a glorious death, nor incompetent enough to be executed for failure. He was a thin man, made thinner by the heat, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that seemed to deflate more each day as the moisture was wrung from his body by Infernace Prime's relentless atmosphere. He gathered us in the Firebase's largest bunker, still barely large enough for 200 men, standing shoulder to shoulder, and delivered the speech I suppose he felt was required of an Imperial officer, addressing troops assigned to what was essentially a suicide posting masquerading as garrison duty. "The Emperor has placed us here for a purpose," he said, his voice steady despite the sweat running in continuous streams down his temples, dripping from his jaw. "The forges of the Imperium require the resources extracted from this world. Every ton of ore that reaches the processing ships in orbit is another round of ammunition for our brothers fighting the Emperor's enemies across the galaxy. Another component in the tanks that will crush the heretic, another fragment of the armor that will protect the faithful. We are the shield that allows that work to continue. We are expendable, but our purpose is not. Remember that when the heat seems unbearable, remember that when you feel your strength failing, you do not serve for your own glory. You serve because the Imperium requires your service, and the Imperium's needs are all that matter. It was a good speech, I suppose, in that it was honest. He didn't promise us we would survive. He didn't suggest our sacrifice would be remembered. He simply told us that our deaths would have meaning in aggregate, that the bullet fired from ammunition produced with ore we protected might kill an enemy we would never see, on a world whose name we would never learn, in a war that would continue long after we were ash and bones. It should have been depressing. Instead, I found it oddly comforting. There was a certain clarity in knowing exactly how little you mattered. The routine established itself with the efficiency of imperial bureaucracy applied to human misery. We rotated through watch shifts on the perimeter walls, 4 hours on and 8 hours off, though the off hours were spent in barracks where the heat made sleep nearly impossible. We drank water constantly, rationed carefully from the recycling plants that turned our own waste and the atmospheric moisture, what little there was, back into something technically potable. It tasted like minerals and chemicals, and had a faintly oily texture that coated your throat. But it kept you alive, mostly. The medics monitored us for signs of heat exhaustion, dehydration, psychological breakdown. They marked names in their ledgers with clinical detachment, tracking which soldiers were approaching critical thresholds of physical or mental collapse. I learned to measure time not by the chronometer but by the sound of the planet itself. Infernace Prime was never silent. In what passed for morning, the volcanic vents in the eastern ranges would erupt with a low grumbling roar that resonated through the ground, a bass note you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. By midday, if you could call it midday, when the sky was always the same shade of dirty amber, the thermal winds would pick up, screaming across the obsidian plains with a keening wail that set your teeth on edge and made communication impossible without shouting. At night, the planet would tick and groan as the surface cooled fractionally, the rockcrete of our bunkers contracting with sharp cracks that sounded like distant gunfire, making us jump and reach for weapons that were already in our hands. The heat played tricks with your mind, subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. You would see movement in the rippling air above the lava flows, shadows that resembled marching figures or prowling beasts, gone when you blinked or turned your head. You would hear voices in the wind, almost words that never quite resolved into language, but carried the cadence of conversation, of warning, of accusation. Private Jessup swore he could hear his mother calling his name from beyond the perimeter, and we had to restrain him to keep him from walking out into the thermal wastes to find her. He was not the first, nor would he be the last. The orcs came on the 43rd day, though came implies a coordinated assault, and orcs have never been accused of coordination beyond the very basics of pointing themselves at an enemy and moving forward with enthusiastic violence. We detected them first as a dust cloud on the western horizon, visible even through the perpetual haze that hung over everything like a shroud. Captain Morven ordered us to battle stations, and we took our positions along the perimeter wall with a mixture of dread and something that might have been relief. At least an enemy was something concrete to fight, unlike the heat and the tedium and the slow certainty of our own dissolution. They were a small warband, perhaps 50 strong, led by a massive brute, whose skin was the deep green of oxidized copper, and whose arms were augmented with crude mechanical claws that sparked when they scraped together. They came at us across the obsidian flats with typical orc disregard for tactics or self-preservation, bellowing their crude war cries and firing their ramshackle weapons with enthusiasm that exceeded accuracy. We cut them down methodically, our lasguns cracking in disciplined volleys, the heavy bolter emplacements on the wall towers adding their deeper voices to the chorus of killing. It was almost therapeutic, the simple clarity of pointing your weapon at a target and pulling the trigger, seeing it fall, moving to the next target. Purpose delivered in 3-round bursts. We lost 7 men in that first engagement, which Captain Morven declared a victory given the disparity in casualties. 4 were killed by orc return fire, their bodies torn apart by the massive caliber rounds that orc weapons spat with careless abundance. 3 were killed by the heat. 1 collapsed on the wall and tumbled over the edge, landing in a heap on the obsidian plain below where his corpse began to cook almost immediately, the smell of burning flesh adding a new note to Infernace Prime's already overwhelming olfactory assault. The other two simply stopped moving, died standing up with their weapons still in their hands, their bodies surrendering in the middle of combat, because continuing to exist required more energy than they had left to give. We dragged the orc corpses away from the Firebase before they began to rot, which on Infernace Prime meant before they began to literally bake in their own skins. Even dead, they seemed to mock us with their physicality, their massive frames seemingly unbothered by conditions that were killing us with methodical efficiency. I wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, what sort of universe the Emperor had created or inherited where creatures like orcs could thrive while humans withered. It was not a thought I voiced aloud. Such questions were dangerously close to heresy, and while I doubted the Commissariat had any interest in traveling to Infernace Prime to execute soldiers who were already dying, there was no sense in tempting fate. The orc attacks became regular features of our existence, arriving every 10 to 15 days with the inevitability of tides or taxation. They were never large enough to overwhelm our defenses, but they were consistent enough to prevent complacency, to ensure that we could not simply retreat into ourselves and wait for death or reassignment, whichever came first. Each attack cost us men, sometimes from enemy fire, more often from the exertion of combat in heat that turned fighting into a form of suicide by degrees. The medics began to quietly categorize soldiers by their expected remaining operational lifespan. You could see it in their eyes when they examined you, a calculation taking place behind their professional detachment. How many more weeks does this one have? How many more fights? I discovered the bodies on day 79 during a routine patrol of the Firebase's southern perimeter. Private Chenault and Trooper Hollis, both assigned to the same patrol route 2 days earlier, both reported as having returned safely from their duty. But there they were, slumped in the shadow of a rockcrete bunker where the temperature was merely lethal instead of immediately fatal, their throats cut with precision that spoke of a blade drawn across yielding flesh with practiced confidence. Their weapons were gone, their ration packs were missing, their water containers had been drained. I reported it to Lieutenant Kashim, who reported it to Captain Morvan, who convened a formation and delivered a speech about vigilance and the importance of trust within the ranks. He did not mention the obvious implication. Someone in our garrison was killing fellow guardsmen for their supplies. He did not need to mention it. We all understood. The heat was making us desperate, and desperate men do desperate things, and the thinnest veneer of civilization the Imperium had layered over us was beginning to crack like paint on sun-baked metal. Security patrols doubled. We began moving in groups never smaller than 4, watching each other as carefully as we watched the perimeter, trying to determine who among us had crossed the line from soldier to murderer, who had decided that their own survival was worth more than the lives of their brothers. But suspicion was a luxury we could barely afford. To suspect everyone was to trust no one, and an army that does not trust itself is already defeated, its destruction merely a matter of time and opportunity. The deaths continued. Trooper Vex, found in the water reclamation chamber with his skull caved in. Private Danish, discovered in his bunk with a bayonet between his ribs, positioned so precisely that he might have died without waking, a small mercy in a place devoid of them. Specialist Torren, who vanished from his guard post and was never found, though we searched every meter of Firebase Leonidas twice and found nothing but the oppressive heat and our own growing paranoia. Captain Morvan ordered an investigation, assigned Lieutenant Kashim to conduct interviews and compile evidence. It was a futile gesture, and we all knew it. What evidence could exist in a place where everyone was slowly dying, where heat exhaustion and dehydration produced symptoms indistinguishable from madness, where the very act of thinking clearly was an achievement that grew more difficult with each passing day? Kashim interviewed every soldier in the garrison, took notes in a data slate that he consulted with the air of a man performing a ritual whose purpose had been lost to time. He filed his report. It concluded nothing. The deaths continued. I began to wonder if there was a killer at all, or if we were simply finding creative ways to die that looked like murder because we needed there to be a reason beyond the simple truth that Infernace Prime was killing us and we were complicit in our own deaths by virtue of still breathing. Perhaps Trooper Vex had fallen and struck his head. Perhaps Private Danish had taken his own life and positioned the blade to make it look like someone else's hand. Perhaps Specialist Torren had simply walked into the wastes and let the planet finish what our deployment had started. But then, I caught him. On day 112, during the false night's orange dimness, I saw Sergeant Cullis kneeling over the body of Private Wren, a good soldier who had lasted longer than most, his throat freshly opened, and blood still pulsing weakly from the wound. Kulaz was filling his canteen from Wren's water container, working with the efficient movements of someone who had performed this task many times before. He looked up as I approached, and I saw no guilt in his eyes. No shame, only the flat calculation of a predator interrupted while feeding. He was going to die anyway, Kulaz said, his voice matter-of-fact. They all are. We all are. But I'm not ready yet. I have a few more days in me, maybe a week if I'm careful, if I'm supplied. I should have shot him. I should have raised my lasgun and burned a hole through his chest and delivered the Emperor's justice to a man who had murdered his brothers for a few extra swallows of recycled water and a handful of ration bars. But I didn't. I stood there in the orange darkness, feeling the heat radiate up from the ground through the soles of my boots, hearing the distant roar of volcanic vents and the keening of thermal winds, and I understood exactly why he had done what he had done. Because on Infernace Prime, survival was not a birthright or even a reasonable expectation. It was something you stole from others. A zero-sum equation where every day you continued to breathe was a day someone else could not. How many? I asked. He thought about it, or pretended to think about it, his eyes distant, in a way that suggested he was performing a calculation he had performed many times already. 11, he said. Including this one. 11 men who would have died in the next few days anyway. I just accelerated the timeline, redistributed resources to someone who could still use them effectively. 11 men. 11 soldiers who had taken the same oath I had taken, who had boarded the same transport ships, who had survived the same drop to this hell world, all killed by one of their own because the Imperium had sent us to die but had not provided us with enough resources to die slowly. It should have filled me with rage. It should have moved me to immediate action. Instead, I felt only a tired recognition of inevitability. Sergeant Cullis was a symptom, not a disease. The disease was Infernace Prime itself, and the Imperium's willingness to spend lives like currency in places that served no strategic purpose beyond maintaining the fiction that every world touched by the Emperor's light was worth defending. I should execute you, I said. You should, he agreed. But you won't. Because you understand. Because you've felt it too. That urge to do whatever it takes to see one more sunrise, even if the sunrise here looks like the end of the world. Because you know that in a week, maybe 2, you'll be in my position, and someone will find you kneeling over a body, and you'll say the same thing I'm saying now. They were going to die anyway. He was wrong, I told myself. I was not capable of what he had done. I was still a soldier of the Imperium, bound by duty and honor and the oaths I had sworn when I joined the Guard. But even as I formed the thoughts, I felt their hollowness. Honor was a luxury for men who were not dying by degrees in a place that treated human life as nothing more than a resource to be consumed in the Emperor's name. Duty was what got you killed following orders that made no tactical sense. The oaths I had sworn assumed conditions where survival was at least theoretically possible, not places like Infernace Prime where existence itself was an exercise in delayed execution. I let him go. I turned and walked away, back toward my bunk in the barracks, where the heat made sleep impossible and the darkness hid nothing. I did not report what I had seen. I did not tell Captain Morvan or Lieutenant Kashim. I simply added another weight to the collection I carried. Another piece of evidence that the man I had been when I arrived on this planet was dying just as surely as my body was. Just more slowly, cell by cell, and choice by choice. The orc attacks intensified as we entered the 4th month of our deployment. The warbands grew larger, better armed, more coordinated in their assaults. We repelled them each time, but the cost mounted with each engagement. Our ammunition stores dwindled faster than the supply drops could replenish them. Our casualties exceeded our ability to maintain proper defensive rotations. Captain Morvan began pulling soldiers from non-essential duties, if any duty on a firebase could be considered non-essential to man the walls during attacks, until every able-bodied guardsman was committed to defending a position that was becoming less defensible with each passing day. The Adeptus Mechanicus mining operation continued without interruption, which I suppose was the point. We received regular Vox communications from the tech priests, inquiring about our ability to maintain security, delivering production quotas in that flat mechanical tone that suggested they regarded us as components in a machine rather than living men dying for their profit margins. Captain Morvan assured them that the firebase remained secure, that the orcs posed no significant threat to the extraction operations. He did not mention that we were down to 60% of our original strength, that half of our casualties were from environmental factors rather than enemy action, that we were eating our rations cold because the heat was so intense that consuming hot food risked vomiting and dehydration. On day 147, Private Hollis, not the Hollis who had been murdered on day 79, but a different Hollis, because the Guard had a peculiar tendency to recycle names, as if human beings were interchangeable. Parts began screaming during evening formation. He simply opened his mouth and released a sound that started as words, fragments about the heat, and the sky, and the ground melting beneath his feet, then deteriorated into pure animal terror. He screamed until his voice broke, then continued screaming in a hoarse whisper that was somehow worse than the full-throated version. The medics sedated him, strapped him to a gurney, locked him in what passed for our infirmary. He died that night, his heart simply stopping as if his body had decided that continued consciousness was no longer tolerable. I understood exactly how he felt. The heat was not constant, I had learned. It varied by small degrees that became canyons of difference when you were living at the edge of human tolerance. There were days when the temperature reached 53 degrees, when simply standing motionless was enough to make your vision swim and your thoughts become sluggish and disconnected. There were days when it dropped to 45 degrees, and those days felt like winter, like relief, like evidence that survival might be possible. But the average was always climbing, always pushing us closer to the point where human biology simply could not continue, where the chemical reactions that sustained life would denature in the heat, and we would all become nothing more than complicated meat, cooking slowly in our own skins. The sounds were what truly indicated our collective deterioration. It began subtly, a change in the quality of conversation during mealtimes and guard shifts. We spoke less. When we spoke, our words were clipped, efficient, stripped of anything resembling personality or humor. We communicated in the language of duty and necessity, nothing more. The silence between words grew longer, filled with the planet's own terrible symphony. The roar of volcanic vents, the keening of thermal winds, the tick and crack of cooling rockcrete, and beneath it all, a new sound that I could not quite identify at first. It was a low susurrus, like whispered prayer or distant conversation, constant and ubiquitous and impossible to locate. I asked others if they heard it. Some said yes, some said no. Some looked at me with the flat effect of men who had stopped caring about anything beyond their immediate survival. I began to think I was hallucinating, that the heat had finally broken something essential in my brain, and I was hearing the sound of my own dissolution. But then Trooper Mendax mentioned it during a guard shift, pointed out across the obsidian plains toward the distant glow of lava flows and said, "The planet is talking. Can you hear it? It's saying we don't belong here. It's saying we should leave." He was right, of course. We didn't belong here. Humans were not designed for worlds like Infernace Prime, but leaving required orders we would never receive, transport we could not summon, permission from authorities who viewed us as resources allocated to a specific purpose and not people capable of making our own determinations about survivability. We were here until we died, or until the Imperium decided our deaths had purchased sufficient value to justify reassigning whatever poor bastards would replace us. On day 170, the nature of the orc attacks changed. Instead of frontal assaults, they began conducting raids at irregular intervals, small groups hitting the perimeter in multiple locations simultaneously, not attempting to breach our defenses but simply forcing us to respond, to run along the walls in the devastating heat, to engage targets that would vanish back into the wastes before we could inflict meaningful casualties. It was asymmetrical warfare, and it was working. Each raid cost us men not to enemy fire, but to exhaustion and heatstroke. The orcs had apparently learned that they didn't need to kill us directly. They could simply make us kill ourselves, through exertion in conditions that made exertion fatal. Captain Morven called a council of his remaining officers, Lieutenant Kashim and Lieutenant Vaughan, both barely functional, both moving with the slow deliberation of men consciously managing their energy expenditure because they no longer had energy to waste. They discussed tactics and defensive modifications and patrol rotations, speaking in low voices, while the rest of us pretended not to listen from our positions around the barracks. Their conclusion was inevitable. We did not have the strength to maintain our current defensive posture. We would need to contract the perimeter, abandon the outer ring of bunkers, consolidate our remaining forces into a smaller footprint that we could defend with fewer men. It was the correct decision militarily. It was also an admission that we were losing, that Infernace Prime was defeating us through simple thermodynamic inevitability. We executed the contraction over the course of 3 days, moving ammunition and supplies from the outer bunkers to the inner defensive ring, rigging demolition charges to deny the abandoned positions to the orcs, though I doubted they would have any use for rockcrete bunkers baked brittle by months of relentless heat. The orcs watched us work, small groups visible on the horizon, observing our withdrawal with what I imagined was satisfaction, though trying to interpret orc psychology was an exercise in futility. They were alien in ways that went beyond physiology, motivated by imperatives we could not understand even if we wanted to. The new perimeter was more defensible, but also more cramped, more oppressive. We were packed closer together now, our bunks separated by mere centimeters, our privacy reduced to whatever small bubbles of personal space we could claim through sheer force of will and social convention. The smell of unwashed bodies and recycled air intensified. Tempers grew shorter. Fights broke out with increasing frequency. Violent scuffles that had to be physically separated before they escalated into something that would cost us another soldier. Captain Morven began conducting summary executions for disciplinary infractions, shooting men in the head for the crime of striking a fellow guardsman or refusing a direct order. It was wasteful and counterproductive, but it was also necessary, because the alternative was complete breakdown of cohesion and discipline, which would kill us all faster than the heat ever could. I found myself thinking about Sergeant Cullis often, wondering if he was still alive, still hunting among us for resources to steal and lives to abbreviate in service of his own continued existence. I had not seen him since that night on day 112, had not sought him out, had not reported him. His presence in the garrison had become another weight I carried, another failure of duty that I could not bring myself to address, because addressing it would require acknowledging truths about my own moral deterioration that I was not ready to face. It was easier to focus on immediate concerns, maintaining my weapon, conserving my strength, drinking water at precisely calculated intervals to prevent dehydration, without overtaxing the recycling plant's capacity. The whispered sounds that Trooper Mendax had mentioned grew more pronounced as we entered the 6th month. Or perhaps they had always been that pronounced, and we were only now capable of hearing them properly, our psychological defenses worn down to the point where we could no longer filter out the things we were not supposed to perceive. The planet was speaking, though speaking might be the wrong word. It was more that the planet was present in a way that inanimate geology should not be, making its displeasure at our presence known through subtle vibrations and acoustic phenomena that bypassed rational interpretation and spoke directly to the primitive parts of our brains that still remembered what it meant to be prey in a hostile environment. On day 183, I discovered what I can only describe as evidence of previous occupation. I was on patrol along the inner perimeter when I noticed a section of rockcrete that seemed weathered in a way that did not match the rest of Firebase Leonidas's construction. The surfaces were smoothed, worn down by time rather than heat, and when I examined it more closely, I found markings scratched into the material, names, dates, brief messages in low Gothic. They were not recent. The dates went back 7 years, then 10 years, then further still, becoming harder to read as the rockcrete itself eroded away the evidence of whoever had carved them. I reported this to Lieutenant Kashim, who examined the markings with professional interest that bordered on the academic, recording them in his data slate with the same attention he had given to his murder investigation. He presented his findings to Captain Morvan, who listened with the patient exhaustion of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything Infernace Prime could reveal. The conclusion was inevitable. Firebase Leonidas was not the first garrison stationed here. There had been others, perhaps many others, stretched back across decades of Imperial occupation, and judging by the fact that those names were carved into bunkers we currently occupied rather than being delivered as testimony by the soldiers who had carved them, none of those previous garrisons had survived to rotation or reassignment. How long were they here? I asked Lieutenant Kashim when we were alone, speaking in the low tones of men sharing information they suspected they were not supposed to possess. The earliest date I could make out was 41 years ago, he said, but the erosion patterns suggest there might be older markings beneath the readable layer. This base has been here for a very long time, Corporal, and it has been garrisoned by men like us for most of that time. Men who arrived, served their duty, and died without ever leaving. Why haven't we been told? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because the knowledge would serve no purpose, Kashim said. Because the Imperium does not owe us explanations. Because we are here to do a job, and whether that job has been done by 100 previous garrisons or 1,000 previous garrisons makes no difference to the current quotas that need to be met. We serve until we can no longer serve. That is the beginning and end of our purpose. He was right. Of course, the Imperium operated on scales of time and space that made individual human lifespans irrelevant. What did it matter that this firebase had consumed generations of guardsmen? The mining operation continued. The ore was extracted. The forges of the Imperium received their raw materials. The machine continued to function, and if that function required regular infusions of human life to lubricate its gears, well, the Imperium had proven over 10,000 years that it possessed an inexhaustible supply of human life to expend. The orc attacks stopped on day 201, not gradually, not with decreasing frequency that suggested they were losing interest or strength, but abruptly, a cessation so complete that it took us 3 days to accept that it was real, and not simply a gap in their raiding schedule. We maintained our defensive posture, waiting for the assault that would surely come, but the horizon remained empty except for the heat shimmer and the distant glow of lava flows. The orcs had vanished as if they had never existed, leaving us alone with the planet and each other, and the growing certainty that something had changed in ways we could not yet comprehend. Captain Morvan sent out patrol teams to investigate. Small groups of our strongest remaining soldiers dispatched into the wastes to search for signs of orc encampments or troop movements. They returned hours later, heat-sick and delirious, reporting that they had found nothing. No bodies, no camps, no evidence that orcs had ever been within 100 kilometers of Firebase Leonidas. It was as if the entire species had been erased from Infernace Prime's surface, leaving us as the planet's only human occupants. They knew, Trooper Mendax said during evening formation, his voice carrying across the silence that had become our default state. The orcs knew something we don't. They knew it was time to leave. Captain Morven ordered him to silence, but the damage was done. The thought had been planted, and thoughts like that grew quickly in minds that had been starved of anything resembling hope for 200 days. What could make orcs flee? What could frighten creatures that seemed to regard death as entertainment and combat as a form of recreation? What was worse than the orcs, worse than the heat, worse than everything we had already endured? The answer came on day 217, which is today, which is the day I am recording this testimony into a Vox unit whose battery will outlive me by hours I will not live to count. It began with a sound, except sound might be the wrong word, because what we experienced was felt as much as heard, a vibration that started deep in the planet's core and traveled upward through layers of magma and semi-molten rock, until it reached the surface where we stood and shook us like insects trapped in a jar, being rattled by a boasting, careless child. The volcanic vents in every direction erupted simultaneously, columns of superheated ash and gas rising kilometers into the already polluted atmosphere, turning the orange sky black and the black sky red, and the red sky into something that had no name in human language. The temperature began to climb, not by small degrees that could be endured through discipline and rationed water, but by 5 degrees in an hour, then 10 degrees, then 15. The heat became a physical force, a pressure that squeezed your chest and made each breath feel like inhaling fire. The rockcrete bunkers began to crack audibly, structural integrity failing as the materials reached the limits of their thermal tolerances. The obsidian plains beneath our boots began to soften, becoming tacky and then liquid, the ground itself transforming into a surface that could no longer support human weight. Captain Morven ordered evacuation procedures, called for transport from the Adeptus Mechanicus mining operation, received a response that was calm and unhurried and utterly devoid of sympathy. The tech priests informed us that current atmospheric conditions made air travel inadvisable, that we should shelter in place until the volcanic activity subsided, that our situation was regrettable but not unexpected given the planet's known geological instability. They said this in their flat mechanical voices while we stood in bunkers whose walls were beginning to glow red at the edges, while men began dropping from heat exhaustion despite standing motionless, while the planet we had been assigned to defend revealed its true nature as something that had never wanted defenders, only victims. The fortress began to collapse around us, not dramatically but with terrible gradual inevitability, one bunker at a time, succumbing to heat and structural fatigue, until the once proud defensive perimeter was nothing more than crumbling rockcrete and exposed rebar glowing cherry red in the superheated air. We retreated to the central command bunker, the last structure still maintaining something resembling integrity. 37 men crammed into a space designed for 15, breathing air that tasted like poison and felt like liquid fire in our lungs. Captain Morven stood at the center of the bunker, his uniform soaked through with sweat that evaporated almost immediately in the intense heat, his face slack with the exhaustion of a man who had accepted his fate. "We will die here," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But we will die as soldiers of the Imperium, having done our duty to the last. The Emperor protects those who serve him faithfully, and if that protection manifests as a quick death rather than a slow one, we should be grateful for his mercy." Some men prayed. Some simply stood silently, conserving their final reserves of strength for those last moments of consciousness before the heat overwhelmed their biological capacity to maintain function. Some wept, though their tears evaporated before they could fall, salt crusting on their cheeks like small white scars. I checked my Vox unit's battery one final time, confirmed it still had power, and began recording this testimony, because someone should know what happened here, should know that we held the line, even when the line was drawn across a surface that was literally melting beneath our feet. The heat continued to rise. 60 degrees. 65. 70. Numbers that ceased to have meaning because they exceeded the parameters of survivability so completely that the specific value became irrelevant. Men began to collapse, their bodies simply surrendering, and we left them where they fell because there was nowhere to move them to, no cooler location that would make any difference. The command bunker's ventilation system failed with a grinding scream of metal on metal, and the temperature inside began climbing even faster without the minimal cooling that inadequate system had been providing. I saw Sergeant Cullis in the corner, still alive, still conscious, his eyes meeting mine across the collapsing space with an expression that might have been apology or might have been accusation, or might have been nothing more than recognition of our shared fate. He had killed 11 men to buy himself a few extra days of existence, and now those days had ended with the same finality that would have claimed him if he had never murdered anyone at all. His crimes and his choices and his desperate grasp at survival amounted to nothing in the face of a planet that had been destined to kill us all from the moment we arrived. The walls of the command bunker began to glow, the rockcrete radiating heat inward now, rather than providing even the illusion of protection. I could feel my skin blistering, my hair beginning to singe, my lungs struggling to extract oxygen from air that was too hot to support human respiration. My vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from the edges, as my brain began to shut down non-essential systems in a futile attempt to preserve consciousness for a few more seconds. I thought about the names carved into the rockcrete of the bunkers we had occupied, wondered if anyone would find evidence of our garrison when the next group of poor bastards was deployed to Firebase Leonidas to defend mining operations that would continue regardless of how many lives they consumed. The Imperium would send more soldiers. They would arrive, they would serve, they would die, and the machine would continue turning because that was what machines did. They processed inputs and produced outputs, and if the inputs were human lives and the outputs were strategic resources, well, that was simply the nature of empire on a galactic scale. We were always expendable. We were always going to die here. The only variable was how long it would take and how much suffering we would experience before the end. The Vox unit in my hand is growing hot, the battery casing beginning to deform in the heat. I have perhaps 1 more minute of recording time before it fails completely or before I lose consciousness, whichever comes first. If you are listening to this, if you are one of the soldiers in the next garrison, know that we held the line as long as we could. Know that we served faithfully even when faith became indistinguishable from delusion. Know that the Emperor did not protect us, but that we did our duty regardless, because duty was all we had left when everything else, hope, comfort, the expectation of survival had been stripped away by heat and time, and the simple mathematics of imperial resource allocation. My name was Corporal Venko Harith of the 88th Helican Rifles. I served on Infernace Prime for 217 days. I watched good men die for no strategic purpose beyond maintaining the fiction that every world claimed by the Imperium was worth dying for. I learned that protection means nothing, that duty is its own justification, and that in the end, we are all simply fuel for a machine that will continue running long after we have been consumed by